Hey guys, welcome to another science lesson with HK Math and Science. This video is about natural and human impacts, and the learning intention for today is to develop an understanding of the natural and human factors that affect ecosystems. And by the end of this lesson, we should be able to discuss natural events that affect ecosystems, be able to discuss the human impacts on ecosystems, and finally be able to discuss how we can minimize the human impacts on the ecosystem. So let's just pause the video here and take a couple of minutes to write these down. Alright, so let's start with the changes caused by natural events. So natural events affect ecosystems, and examples of these are seasons such as summer, autumn, winter, and spring, and they affect organisms because of the abiotic factors like we learned in previous lessons, such as rain, temperature, and light availability. Natural disasters also have huge impacts on ecosystems, and while we're on the topic of natural disasters, let's just think about some of the natural disasters that you know of or have heard of or maybe have even experienced. Alright, so the first natural disaster I want to go through, unfortunately, is very common in Australia, and they are bushfires. Bushfires are a common event in Australia. They burn through natural vegetation, plantations, and towns, and some are lit accidentally by humans, whilst others are lit on purpose by arsonists. Other bushfires are caused by lightning strikes. Alright, so I'm sure you guys have all heard of the bushfires that happened earlier this year in Australia. It was a very unfortunate event, so we're pretty well aware of the negative impacts it has on the ecosystem. So let's go through some of the positives. Believe it or not, there are some positives of a bushfire, especially with Australian plants, and many plants are adapted to survive fires and even benefit from fire. Some plants need fire to allow their seed cases to open and release their seeds, and for example, Banksia and Hakea, these two are examples of plants that need fire to open up their seeds. Like we can see on the right here, believe it or not, that is a Banksia. So that's also the name of a house at a school. A bushfire has caused the seed cases of the Banksia on the right to open up and drop their seeds. Notice how they're opening up over here. That was because of the heat from the bushfire. Alright, and the effects of bushfires on the ecosystem in relation to animals, it's got more of a negative effect on animals than plants. Slow moving animals that cannot escape fires by burrowing or migrating may be killed, and the dead are replaced by surrounding populations expanding back into the burnt out area after the fire. Finally, fire promotes the growth of fresh shoots that are highly nutritious for herbivores, which therefore benefit from the fire. So that's one good point for the animals from fires. Right, now moving on to our next natural disaster. This is known as a drought, and a drought is simply a period of no rain or low rainfall. And Australia also suffers from regular droughts, which is pretty closely linked to the bushfires. Alright, so the effects of a drought on the ecosystem includes increasing the death rate of plants. Death of these plants removes a resource for animals that use the plants for food, shelter, and nesting sites. So the animals also are affected, so then they have to either migrate out or unfortunately die. Loss of plants can also cause soil erosion by wind because nothing is holding the soil in place. And when rain returns, water erosion can further damage the land by washing away the soil. So drought is another big natural event that affects our ecosystems. Now moving on, so the opposite to drought is flooding, and flooding is a result of heavy rainfall, and this often occurs when rivers overflow to the drier areas of the land. So the effects of flooding, this increases the death rates of plants and animals. Animals and plants drown from lack of oxygen, and also in drier areas, the increased rainfall can also lead to an explosion of life. So animals and plants reproduce rapidly to take advantage of the extra food and favorable living conditions caused by the extra water. Alright, so these are just a couple of the main natural events that change and affect our ecosystem. Let's move on to some human impacts now. Humans can also affect ecosystems in a negative way. Let's just think about some examples and write them in our books or on a puzzle. And more recently, us humans have been making an effort to minimize our negative impacts on the ecosystem. What kind of movements and changes in our behavior have we started to implement in our schools and in our daily lives? And what else can we do to achieve minimizing our negative impact on the ecosystem? Let's just have a think about this and write this in our books or also on a puzzle. So the first one I want to go through is known as habitat destruction, and habitat destruction is damage done to the environmental factors an organism depends on for survival. So a couple of examples of this is land clearing, mining, and logging. So these activities don't necessarily destroy habitats permanently, and ecosystems can be repaired if there is enough knowledge of the environment and resources are available. Alright, so the next major human impact that affects our ecosystems is known as introduced species, and this is when animals and plants are brought into another country. And introduced animals that have become established in the wild are referred to as feral animals. Feral cats and animals often kill native animals, which is a big problem, and have a devastating effect on wildlife, such as cats and foxes. Also, other feral animals destroy habitat and compete with native animals for food, such as rabbits, camels, and mice. Another huge one is chemical pesticides, and insecticides are chemicals that kill insects. Some of the first insecticides that were made were dangerous to animals as well as insects, so they killed insects and they also caused harm to animals. DDT is one example of this, and DDT entered the food chain a while ago because it was carried by wind and water, and DDT was then absorbed by plants and animals that lived in the water. This caused a massive problem due to pesticide accumulation. Alright, so you might not know what pesticide accumulation is just yet, but that's okay, we're going to go through that in the next slide. So I'm going to continue on with the example of DDT. Research in the 1970s found that the amount of DDT increased along the food chain. So this isn't good, remember it kills insects and it's bad for animals as well. More DDT was found in the clam, so looking at this picture on the right, more DDT was found in the clam than the plankton because the clam eats a large amount of plankton. So if you remember from previous lessons, this is a food chain. The clam eats the plankton, and because the clam eats a lot of plankton, it's going to have more DDT, more of the poisonous substance inside it than the plankton. Most of the DDT from the plankton is stored in the clam's body, and then the gull eats a lot of clams, which stores even more DDT in the gull's body. Poisons that build up in this way are called cumulative poisons. So the higher you go on the food chain, the more amount of DDT that scientists found. So in this example, clams had 10 times more DDT than plankton, and gulls had 40 times more DDT as the clam and 400 times more than the plankton. So you can see why that's becoming an issue. Alright, so the last two human impacts on the ecosystem I want to go through today are chemical pollution and overcropping. I won't go through them in much detail because I want you to read them in your books. But chemical pollution, chemicals escaping into the environment can cause damage to ecosystems, and overcropping, I'm going to use animals as an example. Overcropping of animal populations means killing more animals that can be replaced by the normal breeding cycle. So this applies to both animals and plants. Alright, so that brings us to the end of today's science video. Hopefully you guys did learn something from that and have a better understanding of how natural events affect ecosystems, how humans and their behavior affect ecosystems, and finally can discuss how we as humans can minimize our impacts on the ecosystem. Once again, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys all back online.